Well, very good morning to everyone. We're starting off today with a real doozy of a panel. We're talking about how data and technology is changing the way we look at marketing, we look at advertising, we look at storytelling. I have a fantastic panel with me here today, and I'll let them take the trouble of introducing themselves.
Hi everyone, morning. My name is Elli Papadaki, and I head up Programmatic Sales and Strategy for Condé Nast International.
I'm Ben Hookway. I'm the CEO of Relative Insight. We do smart stuff with language.
I'm Blodwell, the CEO of the Programmatic Advisory. We consult brands on how best to apply programmatic.
Andrew Hayward, Head of Programmatic Solutions at The Guardian.
Hi, I'm Laura Dornheim, Head of Communications of eyeo, better known for its product AdBlock Plus.
So the panel today, we've got a great selection of technology companies, a great selection of publishers, and a company in charge of AdBlock. So it's, it's kind of all around. So data, this is what we're here to speak about today. So let's start by asking, what kind of data is powering marketing? What are some of the key trends in data that you guys are seeing now?
Shall I start? I guess from a brand perspective, in marketing, you think about right user, right time, right message, but how you actually enable that is through understanding, and understanding comes in the form of data. And data is kind of in two types. One is what you'd call interpretation and insight, which is reporting and understanding. And then the second is cookies that you see in your browser or device IDs on your mobile phones. What's really powered data-driven marketing is brands wanting to deliver better results, better investment return for how they approach marketing. And so that right message, right user, right time, that's being driven by data. And then I guess again, more personally, it varies by brand, but how they think about data is their own websites, their mobile apps. They work with partners such as publishers to use data. So I think the thing with data is it is so broad. There's so many types of data, and really it's about, on a brand-by-brand basis, what will make most sense for you.
So I guess next, this is more, I guess, for Elli and for Andrew. You guys have platforms that people place ads on. So what is the kind of data that you are collecting to enable this to happen?
I'll start.
Yeah.
We don't really collect data as such. What we do is we look and try to understand user behavior across our site. So using information from Google Analytics, so information supplied to us by Google that explains browsing behavior across the entire wide network, we then try to understand where do those people go on our site, what kind of content do they consume, what kind of behavior they're exhibiting. And as such, then we're able to advise the brands that if we're looking for consumers with a certain behavior, these are the sites that they index highly in, but we don't, as such, sort of track and target individual users.
I think how we're using data, there's two sides to this. So obviously, as a publisher, we are storytellers in our own right. That's what we're professionals at. So where we're using data is on the flip side around the content and looking at how users engage. Helping our editorial to gain insights as to what's performing, what our readers like, what are they engaging with, and then I guess taking that data and looking at how we can help our business partners, the agencies and advertisers, better understand what the user is doing on The Guardian and almost enriching their understanding of their data sets and going, actually, this is what your user is actually doing on The Guardian, so it might they might not realise that they're a sports enthusiast or a finance guru or something like that, so helping them enrich their understanding.
So from what you're seeing, what are some of the best ways you feel that brands should be using platforms like the ones you guys have?
The best way that they should be using platforms is, well, they should, I think, engaging with us more directly and working with us to understand the value. I think there's been a little bit of a disconnect in terms of the quality and value sort of concept, and I think we need to realign that, and publishers know our audience and know our market value better than anyone else. So we can empower buyers to understand the value of premium publishers, then we can hopefully drive up ROI of digital advertising and storytelling.
And just to add to what Andrew said, as a publisher, we have a responsibility to try and help brands understand how to connect the dots between the different parts of activity that they do with publishers. So for instance, if someone's doing a lot of branded content with a publisher, they tend to then do a separate pot of investment for display activity, and often it's completely unconnected. So what we're trying to do is try to help them understand these are the audiences you're targeting, or these are the people that are engaging with your content that we have co-created. If you would then like to communicate another message with them, we need to understand and think about how that journey ensues. Speaking about data, there's been an overemphasis on hyper-targeting users, but it seems that we've all sort of gotten lost a little bit in that and forgotten about the importance of context and the power of context and just pure branding, being seen at the right place at the right time.
So you mentioned very good there, hyper-targeting users. So this is a trend that we are, of course, seeing a lot of, where we're using analytics, big data to sort of really zoom in. But stuff like GDPR is happening. Data privacy is now more relevant than ever. So do you think now it's a good time to rethink some of the strategies around this sort of super hyper-targeting?
So post-GDPR, one of the things we noticed as a publisher, because I think all the publishers were concerned, the impact that the enforcement of the law was going to have on revenues. We just saw that there is a shift more to more qualitative sources of data, and also for brands and marketeers are then to start focusing again on the importance of context. Absolutely, data is important, especially when it comes from reliable and qualitative sources. But actually the environment in which something is seen seems again to come back to the forefront.
I think, just building on what Elli just said, in the part around data coming from reliable sources as well, I see GDPR as a good thing, because it will strengthen those reliable sources and sort of push marketeers towards using them rather than sort of aggregated amounts of third-party data.
Yeah, and I think from a data perspective, as a brand, just because you can collect it doesn't mean you should. So, for example, if you, there are some quite category-sensitive products that brands sell. That doesn't mean you should go there and hammer them with ads promoting that product. The classic is you have a man is researching an engagement ring, and then you start chasing that device around the internet with an engagement ring. All of a sudden, the girlfriend becomes aware. It's like, oh, this is a bit strange. So there's just ways I think brands need to be a bit more responsible. And I think a second to that is if you're like a big digital retailer, like an Amazon, like an Asda, etc., you get to see transaction value. So you can start to work out things like affluence and propensity to buy certain products. You have to be very careful of how you use that data as a brand, because I think if you become intrusive, you will disconnect with the consumer and potentially damage a relationship you may have had for much longer than just a quick next sale. I think when we talk to brands, we talk about stop thinking about the immediacy of the next sale, the next minute. Think about these relationships with consumers that you can build over time, and you've got to do that in a very sort of respectful way of the consumer.
Yeah, I think GDPR is going to force people to think harder about what data they ought to use. So just to generalize the marketing industry, in a sweeping statement for a minute, there's a tendency to make decisions based on data that's easy to get, rather than the data that you should be using.
So what data should people be using?
So, well, I mean, we come at this from a slightly different angle, in that everything that we do is based on language and how people talk. How you talk expresses what you're interested in, your kind of character, the sort of style of language you tend to use. And this is basic. In marketing, this is really basic stuff, but it's never analyzed. And what we do is treat this as a data source, and we build large-scale models for how audiences talk. And it's pretty simple, but it's incredibly effective.
So, Laura, you work with AdBlock. So basically, your job is to create a product that stops these folks from showing us ads. So what are some of the key things that you guys are seeing on the back end? What do people find annoying, basically?
Well, there's a whole list of what people find annoying. And generally, most of the online ads we see today are perceived annoying. Because, as you just mentioned, we're chasing for the fast click, not we, but the industry is chasing for the fast click and is looking at easily available data, and it doesn't really take into consideration the user anymore. And I mean, all of us, be we marketers or publishers or whatever, we're also consumers. So it shouldn't be too hard to understand that it's not helpful to really annoy your users. So what we see is that, yes, there's a long list of what people are annoyed with. Nobody really likes pop-ups. Nobody likes looking for that tab that just started playing music when you're in the office. But there is, and I think that's really the interesting part, there is also quite a long list of ads that are acceptable, even to people who decided to block ads. So there's a lot of people, roughly 150 million around the globe now, that say, I'm done with online advertising as it is. And they install an ad blocker, and some of them install AdBlock Plus. But the exact same people are also okay when you show them subtle ads, like a static banner above a text, not something that interrupts their user flow, not something where they feel completely stalked because they just looked at that handbag 3 days ago or something. They want to feel respected. And if you do that, and I think it's not that hard, then you can reach these users as well. And I think that's the very important message, that ad blocking is actually not here to kill the advertising industry, to kill publisher, but really here to help that industry get better, because we all know the web depends on advertising. I'd also like to see a shift there. I very much like what The Guardian does with other models of monetization. But yeah, we want to help teach the industry, the advertising industry, what some of them seem to have forgotten, that is how to actually reach a user.
So do you think that, I mean, this is to the panel, of course, do you think that on the big platforms like the ones Condé Nast, the ones The Guardian has, is there responsibility on the publisher to ensure that the ads being shown on the platform are up to a certain standard, up to a certain level?
Absolutely. And I completely agree with Laura as to how we found ourselves in this position. At The Guardian, we have this catchphrase of fewer better, and we really are trying to follow that. So we went through a process of stripping back ads, taking off those annoying sticky banners on mobile web as an example, and really cleaning it up. And the ad effectiveness went up as we did that. So it ultimately then ends up being better for the marketeer and the advertiser, because their ROI starts to go up, and the user experience goes up as well. So I think this notion of more ads on the page means more money or more revenue for the publisher is not true at all. All you're doing is flooding a market with inventory that doesn't have a value as well. And I think potentially another reason in the rise of ad blockers is people don't like being targeted, or there's this notion of they don't like being followed. And when you get really intrusive ads, it stands out. That's the physical manifestation of targeting, or to the user it is. So it then leads them to install an ad blocker. So I think if we take a step back as publishers and realize our responsibility, that obviously we have the relationship with the end user, it's up to us to ensure that A, we don't flood them with ads, but B, we also maintain and control our supply chain and work with partners who really control that as well from the demand side.
Yeah, I think it's an evolution as well, because digital marketing just sort of popped up almost from nowhere. There was this thing called the internet, and all of a sudden you can do advertising on it. And people are like, well, I've been doing TV for like 50 years. Let's just try and take over another screen. This is how it should work. And that's why you get these pop-ups and rich media. But I think what's happening in this evolution is marketers are understanding that your mobile phone and your TV are just amazingly different in terms of how you engage with them. So I think it's just this evolution going back to thinking about the consumer, the device, and what's sensible to actually put in front of a consumer without them blocking ads, and actually, wanting to engage with them. But there would be a bunch of people who just don't want advertising, the same people who skip through TV ads or walk out the room. But there'd be a bunch of people where hopefully you can actually make a meaningful impact with advertising and actually show them things which adds a lot of value to them and their lives.
Could be as well a good time to rethink about things like KPIs, because going back to what Laura said about chasing the click, Retargeting came very much as a way to try and do get to that click, but then technology does still fall short in the sense that any one of us could go onto Amazon and buy something, or any website for that matter, and still get retargeted with an ad about that product for weeks and weeks afterwards. And that is what annoys a consumer. Because I think when people are presented with the opportunity to receive personalized or non-personalized ads, they will say personalized, but within reason. So from a publisher's perspective, just to go back to what Andrew was saying, we do have a responsibility to try and reopen that dialogue with the brands as to what does success look like. And if it's not just, try to move the conversation away from a click, go back and talk about branding and the importance that holds. And also find different ways, whether this is that we do our own research or we find a different way to ask our audience, is this of interest, is this engaging enough? That's just a different way to be able to prove success as opposed to keep focusing on the click.
So I think there's also a confusion between, I think the word personalized ads, the industry sort of thinks one thing, but when consumers say, yeah, personalized ad would be good, what they mean actually is resonant ads. And they're two different things. So the industry will go off, think, well, how can we make it more personalized? We've got all this kind of random data about people, which we think makes a more meaningful ad, putting it in the right place, and so on. And actually, it kind of misses the mark. When they say they want personalized, they want resonance and relevance. And I think the industry's drifted away from actually delivering on what people say they want.
I guess this next one is more for Ben and Wayne. So according to a report from the Chartered Institute of Marketing, 50% of marketing is completely irrelevant to the consumer. So what actions do you feel that brands, platforms, mainly the brands, have to take to ensure that the right ads are getting to the right people?
So I would say that you need to start with understanding your audience properly. And from our point of view at Relative Insight, what that means is figuring out how they talk. What do they talk about? About everything in their life, not just kind of what they're talking about. If you're a car manufacturer, how do they talk about cars? You need to understand people, like properly understand people, and not necessarily through what they've clicked on or what their cookie history is or what their device that they happen to be on. So properly understanding how people talk, what they talk about, how they express themselves, start with that first, because that reveals the trigger points of their interest in your product. It reveals their worldview. It will tell you whether you need to say one word or another in the ad, and so on and so on. You've got to start trying to understand at a holistic point. And in our view, that's based on how people talk.
Yeah, and I think if brands can get a better understanding of their audiences by interrogating different data sources in the respectful and sensible ways, that's the first point. I think the second point is then leveraging tools and technologies that allow you to actually maximize that. So one of the challenges you had with kind of pre-digital is it was a bit of a guessing game, a bit panel-based, a bit, did this go to the audience, didn't it, how much wastage, where now you can actually start to measure all the way through to an individual level. So it's using the tools and tech to go, well, here's our audience, here's where they are, let's engage. And the way you deliver that now is through technologies like Google AdWords, Facebook Ads Manager, demand-side platforms. Use these tools in the right way to make sure you're communicating as effectively as possible once you have that understanding of the audience.
So I guess you said something interesting there. I wanted to sort of segue into Facebook and Google. I mean, there is this notion that it's a duopoly right now, that these two are the be-all and end-all. I mean, to what degree do you agree or disagree?
It's hard to disagree with the numbers in terms of their share of spend. And they have, what they've been very successful at is basically getting eyeballs. And, think about Facebook user numbers are dropping off, but WhatsApp and Instagram are increasing. And they're so big, so much money, they'll just keep buying out eyeballs, basically, and apps and websites that sort of attract them. Sadly, in the world that we live in right now, that's not going to stop. So Facebook and Google will continue. What I think we'll start to see is more legislation come in. I mean, yesterday, Google got a massive fine for $5 billion. That's Android, but you can start to see in other parts of what Google and Facebook do, it is fairly anti-competitive. And it's just trying to maximize their own commercial gains and creates less competition. So I think that's one way we'll see it stop. And then the second way is there's tons of publishers like Condé Nast, The Guardian. There's reams of other publishers you can work with outside of the Facebook and Google's. And then but in the short term, you just have to think about how do you maximize. If you're a marketer, you've got to be sensible. It's pretty difficult to turn off when people are searching for your brand. It's pretty difficult to not engage with an audience that use Facebook platforms every day. But you should also look at other opportunities as well.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of the Google, Facebook versus the publishers, what Google and Facebook have done is made it easier for the buyer, or really easy for the buyer. And that's one thing that publishers, premium publishers, are trying to do better and need to do better. And if we can start to work more collaboratively rather than infighting amongst ourselves and squabbling over the 5% of the spend that we're getting, I think that we're never going to shift the dial in our favour completely, but we can start to move it. So I think key for publishers is to sort of look at Google and Facebook and look at what they've done well, and it's making it easy for the agency or buyer to access the audience at scale.
Just to add, I think it's dangerous to have that much power in so few companies generally, and specifically in our industry, which is representing advertisers. If you look at very macro level, businesses are increasingly under pressure. They're increasingly, every day I'm getting a news alert that someone's closing stores somewhere. So they're trying to get growth and audiences, and the way they do that is through marketing and getting their product out there. If they have restrictions on doing that through a policy that Google or Facebook want to create, that's really bad, because that puts a lot of risk on a lot of jobs, a lot of brands, just because Facebook wants to implement a certain policy or do something in a certain way. So I definitely think that's something which we'll continue to see play out, particularly from the EU, and sort of the sort of anti-competitive stuff. And personally, I just think it's a dangerous place if you end up in 10 years' time, there's only 2 places you can buy advertising. That, for me, is a really bad place to be.
So you're saying basically now we have to rely on the legislators and the politicians to introduce laws to stop Google and Facebook from becoming too big?
I don't think there's any other choice, to be honest.
What's stopping the industry from evolving in a direction that can properly deal with this? Or is it just not going to happen?
I was going to say, if you flip back to the regulation side, so tech goes in cycles, but so does policy, and so do politicians. And I'm old enough to have been in the industry when Microsoft were sued by the US government under antitrust. And some people might remember that, but that they had to break up the browser from the operating system, and the US government waded in and made this happen. And the degree of dominance Microsoft had with Windows in that context was, I would say, less, relatively speaking, to what Facebook and Google have now. But it's just the sort of appetite for regulation goes in cycles as well. Frankly, I'm actually really surprised it hasn't happened to a much bigger degree already. And I think actually, and it's not just Google and Facebook. I think you'll see Amazon under scrutiny as well, actually.
So going back towards the ads themselves, they are becoming more scientific. We're using more AI, more data-driven approach. So what are some of the common pitfalls you see that prevents the consumer from engaging with the advert?
Poor-looking ads, to be honest. Where you just see an ad and go, that just looks terrible. That's one of the biggest pitfalls I think brands suffer with, where they really focus on, if you're a travel brand, I know you're going to fly from Gatwick, I know you want to go to Barbados, let's crowbar that into some sort of small ad format, and it looks rubbish. So I think the biggest pitfall where consumers just don't engage is just, aesthetically unpleasing advertising.
I would say it's kind of context and really relating to their world. So we ran a big program in the US from a mobile phone manufacturer recently, and we figured out through understanding the language of these two audiences for different mobile phones that there were sort of 5 differences in their passion points. And so that was quite simple. You understand the differences, you understand what they're interested in. There are 5 new bits of creative pushed out through channels for those people in those passion points. And the result was, I think it was a 67% increase in qualified landing rate of the ads. And that's just simply figuring out who these people are, what they're interested in, and just framing your ad and product as something of value in that context. And it's just something that's not done often enough.
Yeah. And I think
just to add to what, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, Laura, go.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues on a meta level is that online ads are still based on the goal of disrupting a user, of like grabbing their attention instead of really working with the context and being relevant. I mean, we talk about relevancy all the time, but actually most of what you still see is what you previously mentioned, is like the TV concept. It's like you're watching a show and then boom, here's advertising, and it's just disruption. And digital doesn't work like that. And the attempt of like forcing it to want it to work like that just doesn't work and just annoys users. And I mean, even before they install an ad blocker, what you see is banner blindness. They just start ignoring it. And I can't think it's in any interest of any publisher or any brand to become ignored by the users. So I think one of the most powerful advertising formats that we've seen in the recent years is native advertising, when it's done right, when it's not just a label for badly disguised ads. But for example, what the New Yorker did with Netflix and Orange is the New Black, I think that was one of the masterpieces where really, there was a win-win for publishers and marketers and for users, because it was really interesting, engaging content. It served the brand, it served the publishing house, it was clearly labeled as an ad. I think this is really the direction we should go.
And actually, what I just wanted to add on what Wayne was saying, which from a publisher's perspective we see happen very often, traffic these days is largely on mobile devices. I mean, we've known this for years, it's nothing new. However, day in, day out, we see brands spend significant parts of their budget on desktop executions. And then they just take the same creative and shrink it down to try and fit a tiny device. So there's very little consideration going into how can you engage with a consumer, taking advantage of the power of that small device that we're absolutely glued to every second of the day. And then if you don't adapt your messaging to that device, it's obviously not going to work.
It's just the same.
From my perception, that's the biggest shortfall we see.
Yeah.
And again, frequency, when you retarget the same user, even if they've made a purchase, it's just wasted money. They're not going to re-engage with that creative.
Yeah.
So they want TV to work, they want desktop to work like TV, and now they want mobile to work like desktop, and it's not working.
Yeah.
So just to back up what's been said as well, from our perspective, the most effective ads we've seen are those that we have a digital ad production team in-house that they built, and it's native as well. And the ad effectiveness is through the roof in comparison to when the agency or advertiser, not saying that they can't do the ads right, but I think this is where the publisher can help marketeers be really good storytellers within their context, because we know our context better than anyone else.
Yeah. And your users.
Yeah, and our users,
So basically what the consensus here is that treat the desktop experience, treat the mobile experience as two completely different entities.
Yeah.
So then the way ads...
Actually, sorry, I was going to say, you can actually go further than that.
Okay, hit me.
Right, so I'd say the way, even when you're on a mobile device, you've got Facebook, you've got LinkedIn, you've got different apps, and you've got different communication with different circles. And you hold different personas when you're in these different apps. So actually, ads should be, even within, if it's LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, that you can actually modify ads to be much more relevant for the persona you're in at that moment as well. Because people aren't just demographics, right? They're not just, Ben from Manchester drives a, crappy BMW, and so on and so on. It's 46 as well, by the way. People just, that's not who people are, right? So they hold different interests and personas throughout the day in different contexts. And actually, if you're talking about native, you want to get native with that persona as well. Yeah. And I think there could be a lot more done on that too.
Yeah, definitely agree. So some brands we work with, they are quite high research brands, so they're not instant purchases. So there's no point serving people stuff at 10 a.m. when they're in between meetings, why do you put it on their tablet before they're watching TV or before bed or when they're researching? So I completely agree with Ben. It's about using the context of a person and how they engage with their devices throughout the day, not just the device itself.
So, of course, both Condé Nast and The Guardian are esteemed brands with really high levels of journalistic integrity. So when it comes to stuff like native advertising, content marketing as it's sometimes called, of course, how do you ensure, on your side at least, that what you're creating is useful for the consumer as well as to the brands?
From our perspective, we've now started, if you like, reader panels, so communities with, whether that's with Vogue or whether it's GQ or one of our other brands, where we ask, we talk to people and we say, is this kind of content interesting? And we do this both for brands as well, we know from a sort of ad effectiveness perspective, but from an editorial standpoint, we're now much more aware and trying to have that dialogue with the audience. A lot of what we do is co-branded with and co-authored with a lot of the brands, so we use a lot of, I guess, insights on what they think is going to appeal to their audiences when they're trying to communicate their message across. But we're making a much more concerted effort from an editorial standpoint to have that conversation.
I think we do the same. I mean, at The Guardian, we've got more governance groups than you can throw a stick at as well. So in terms of when we're looking at the process, obviously you ask the consumer, and that's the first point of call. It should always be, what do they like, what do they engage with? And then we take that internally and work to make sure that the standards meet that, and it's as engaging as possible for the user, and the brand then gets a positive experience out of it as well.
Just to add one last thing, and I guess that stands for all publishers, there's now different teams by social media as well, so a different team for Snapchat or Facebook or Twitter to make sure that the way the content is communicated, so going back to the idea of the persona and making sure that what you're putting out is appropriate for the context, it's now, I mean, I imagine most publishers now have been set up this way in order to be able to respond to the way that technology and the user and the way they're consuming media is evolving.
And I think on native, we've done some really interesting stuff on native advertising as well, where, so normally, publications write in a certain way. So The Economist, on the whole, writes in a certain way. And so if there's a native ad there, there's a really interesting question about how native should that ad be, right? So should it be indistinguishable from the style of The Economist writing?
Then we would block it.
Yeah. So I think we've
or should it be some sort of contrast and actually measure? We've done really interesting stuff measuring it. Actually, if it's completely native, it doesn't work as well.
Yeah. So we've taken the stance of it should be. You should be able to tell that it's an ad still.
Yeah. It's also quality of a publication. If The Guardian started to post articles that I just later find out were sponsored content, I would become super skeptical of your other reporting.
Exactly. You'll break the trust of your users. And that's what publishers have worked so hard on with their content and ensuring that it comes from truthful and trustful sources. And if we just start disguising or hiding ads as content almost, then you're going to instantly break that. And
but so we get in the fight, right? So there's often a fight, right? So you got publisher, like brand wants to do certain ad, and publisher needs to convince brand that this ad's really badly written for the context in which it's going. And actually, you can prove that with data. So quite often, and because until we get involved, it's quite a subjective, like debate.
It will often go. It'll be you'll been sat in rooms where it's editorial on one, the brand, then the poor salesperson trying to negotiate between them. But at the end of the day, I don't think it serves anyone purpose to disguise an advert as content.
So Wayne, you work a lot with brands, of course. But do you see a shift in the way brands are looking at marketing? Are they going towards this native advertising, content marketing thing?
Yes and no. It's a bit dependent on the brand, to be honest. As I mentioned earlier, lots of brands have KPIs they need to hit, so they find the best media that hits those KPIs. And those KPIs are typically set on an annual, kind of year-by-year basis. So you kind of need to try to get to the reset and think about the role of things like content, the role of things away from chasing a user around and trying to sort of game a fairly flawed measurement system. That takes time because if you are a marketer and you've got your KPI, and you might be personally bonused on it, you may do industry press releases about it, etc., etc. To completely change that, it takes a really bold and brave marketer to do it, and they often need support from others. So yes, I think we are seeing brands are thinking about it and doing a bit more, but in reality, if you see the breakdown of spend by sort of marketing type, it's still search is 50% digital. Some would argue that's sort of content, some would say it isn't. And then you have like display, which is video, mobile, and banners are still a massive, I think 30-35%. So content's still relatively small in the grand scheme of things.
I think you touched on the KPIs and stuff, and that's really important to note if we're going to affect a change or a shift in the way in which marketeers or agencies construct their plans. Because unfortunately at the moment, fraud and bot traffic and that sort of thing are structured towards fulfilling those KPIs. So fraud is highly viewable, bot traffic is highly clickable. So unless we get a change in the sort of KPIs that we're chasing, it's going to be really, really difficult to get that planner who's bonused on them and is chasing their bonus, rightly so, because that's what they're doing there for their job. They're trying to hit those targets. We're going to struggle to really shift the market.
Yeah, I think, so the other thing I'd say is that it's imperative that we figure this out now before voice comes along, like in a big way. And the whole industry is starting now to figure out how to use voice search and voice interaction as a medium and a messaging and an ad platform, because that is going to get awful. That would be done by even mediocre. That would be awful.
Yeah. I think if voice is like this, it's creepy being followed by a visual ad, but it'd be really weird me sitting in my lounge room going, "Hey Andrew, do you want a Coke while you're watching Handmaid's Tale?" I'd just be like, who's around the corner or something?
Yeah.
So now, of course, actually that's another good segue for me. A lot of good segues. It's a good one. So Gen Z is coming. I mean, millennials like me are now not popular anymore. So how are Gen Zs going to change the way ads are run, ads are consumed?
I mean, I think you can see it as you walk through here in terms of what's coming, the way in which they're consuming content. You've got obviously AR, VR, and those sort of experiences and native placements within that. And there's a question of, is that more of a natural feel as well, because you're in an environment and it will come across as just a billboard. So I think they're changing the face of how they consume, where they consume. And I think they're more sensitive to that being tracked as well. Yeah, it's one big thing.
We've actually just done quite a big thing for a client, sort of modeling how Gen Z talk on social compared with how millennials talk on social. And what we do is model and monitor the difference. So it's the difference you're interested in. And the most interesting thing, there's lots of interesting things about it, but one of the most interesting things is that Gen Z are a lot more conversational. Millennials are a lot more broadcast. So they talk about their awesome day out, me. Sorry, I'm caricaturing here, but it's much more broadcast. The interesting thing about Gen Z is that it's way more they do it as well, but it's more interactive and it's more conversational rather than broadcast. And I think this is going to have a knock-on effect into how you engage them, how they want to be engaged. Is it just going to be about influencer marketing, and so on and so on? I think it's going to be quite key. Yeah, I think
it's also platform adoption. Like I was talking to my 12-year-old cousin who thought Facebook was really uncool, and I was just like, oh great, well that's me looking pretty tragic in front of my cousin. And they use like Snapchat, and then they'll use other things as they come. So I think for brands, if you want to get in front of the sort of Gen Z, it's like you've got to go where they are. You've got to think about the platforms that they're adopting.
Yeah, I'll just agree with everything that those guys have said. I think context, again, is absolutely key. I think I was reading somewhere the difference between, one of the many differences between the millennials and Generation Z is that sort of the millennial generation would have gone through a recession, so they're much more sort of frugal with spending, whereas the next generation isn't so much. Also, education and access to information is very different nowadays, and a lot of people are going straight from university into working, from school into working, as opposed to going through university. So it's subtle changes, it's just evolving, and like with everything that we've been discussing, brands are just going to have to adapt.
So we're almost out of time. So
can I add my thoughts in just a second? Because I think another factor that hasn't been mentioned yet is that the younger and the more digital native they are, or like mobile native maybe now, the more they are used to being in charge of their own experience. They're like, I mean, linear TV to like anyone like under 18 is like, they totally don't get the idea, being like forced to watch a certain thing at a certain time. And that also applies to all other content they consume. So saying like, this is a publication, if you want to read that, you have to watch that ad, it's completely absurd to them. So they're used to like configuring their devices to really cater their very individual needs. And what we see is that that demands a very different approach in advertising, but also, and I'm quite happy about that, that leads to more innovation in monetization models. So maybe getting a little bit back from the ad dependency of the web right now. I mean, right now, most websites are funded with advertising, most apps, or a lot of apps. But with the younger generation, we see that they're more and more happy to actually spend money on content because they never thought of the difference between buying a physical newspaper or reading like digital content. My parents would still say like, that's not something real. My nephews don't get the difference between buying something in Minecraft or buying a Lego toy in the store. So the willingness to pay for something they get is much higher, and I think that means a big shift to think about how else you can monetize them. Maybe it's sometimes purely ads, sometimes it's a combination. You have freemium models, you have paper content, and I think that is a really, really interesting evolution for the web, and of course will change marketing quite drastically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, folks, we are kind of out of time, so could I please have a wonderful round of applause for my panel?